Hey buds, socialism done left here. I'm going to be looking at either one or two Xexizy videos, depending on whether time permits, about the nature of work under socialism. So some background, I am a market socialist. I think that through a combination of shifting workplaces into worker democracy, so that internally workplaces are democratically controlled, to shifting the wealth of society to be dominantly controlled by workers themselves, like individual people having wealth, by having wealth controlled in said cooperative firms, and having it controlled by nationalized firms and a social wealth fund. Basically, those are like the four holders of wealth, and no dominance of individual holding of large wealth. So call that like the equalization of wealth, or as I call it, the compression of class. You've brought up the poor and brought down the rich so that everyone is a worker now. Um, and an introduction of into said nationalized firms, an introduction into like said social wealth funds, and an introduction into like the politics as a whole of greater degrees of direct democracy. It is possible for a combination of markets, state planning, and democratic structures to provide a like worker operated economy that maintains most of the benefits of markets, which I think are substantial, while also maintaining most of the benefits of like low inequality, of worker power, and of democracy, of giving the people control over what is produced and what is useful and what is not. So there is a critique, which you often see framed in a quote. Xexizy, or Muke, I don't know if that's like their dead name or something. Maybe I shouldn't say that, but Xexizy, is apparently he, him, says the hell of super capitalism is the firm, not that the firm has a boss. This was originally a quote from Amadeo Bordiga, who is fundamentally asserting that the hell of capitalism, the reason why capitalism is such a cause of alienation and exploitation, is because of market forces, and that you have to work within a firm. The problem is not that the firm has a boss who tells you what to do. The problem is that you are in a firm subject to market constraints. So, a while ago, so I guess fully explaining the Twitter lore before we get into the videos, super capitalism as like a meme on the left, I guess with some reference to the previous conversation I had today, as a way to like snippily promote this idea of a worker-owned economy. Super capitalism was described as capitalism for more people. Normal capitalism is where only the wealthy get to do capitalism. Super capitalism is where all the workers get to do capitalism. That's pretty good. If capitalism is good, shouldn't we want everyone to do capitalism? Similarly, right now, most workplaces are autocracies, and managers are chosen by a totalitarian unit at the top in this very, very cute drawing from Pink Wug. Love me some Pink Wug comics. But then, under super capitalism, now all of these working capitalists get to choose the manager in a marketplace of ideas. They get to vote for the best ideas. Wow, it sure sounds like we've really made capitalism better. Super capitalism. Working on that still. I'll get it one day. I don't know that Pink Wug's even online. I love Pink Wug stuff. It's very cute, and I think that they generally have pretty good takes. So, in response, Xexizy brought up the Amadeo Bordiga quote. I believe that Amadeo Bordiga was a left communist, but I'm not sure. It's not too important to know where the quote came from. In short, I think that this is wrong. I think that you can basically remove alienation from market forces for a suitable definition of alienation. And therefore, it is not true that the hell of capitalism is the firm. The hell of capitalism is having to participate in market relations. It is possible to make markets work for people through a combination of, like I said, democratic workplaces, and this will be important later, I suppose, if he brings this up, what's called internalizing externalities. Internalizing externalities, basically setting it such that the market price for a good is equivalent to the social price for a good, which therefore makes sure that profit is as close to use value in Marxian terms as possible, to social value, to use like modern econometric terms, as possible. So therefore, you want to make every market want to produce things exactly as much as society would want to produce them. Right now, when we talk about externalities, usually what we mean is Society overproduces things which pollute because an individual firm doesn't pay if they pollute. An individual firm does pay only for the process of producing their product. But you could raise the cost of pollution by, say, taxing pollution, by regulating pollution, and this forces the market to come closer to social use value. Let me check if my cat's outside. That fucker is such a trickster. All right. Isn't super capitalism that Mussolini thing? Mussolini did call his vision of capitalism as super capitalism. I do like calling, I do think that calling things super capitalism are pretty funny. So I got mad. I said, I'm begging Borticus to provide an alternate economic mechanism which doesn't involve the coercion that they're talking about instead of pithy quotes. Because one of the things that I would argue is if the argument is that participating in a firm in market relations is alienating because you don't fully get to decide what you produce, how much of it, why, in what methods. Those things are determined by the market and by the democratic workplace, so that they're outside of your control. It's alienating. It makes you feel distant from your work. It makes you feel like you don't have control. These are also problems with basically the only other form of economics which works for scarcity: planning. When the state tells you to do something, or when the local commune tells you to do something, they're still forcing you to do something. They're still directing your work. So I get mad about this. So Xexizy linked me these two videos. First, will we have to work under socialism? And two, what constitutes a socialist society? With that, I will be reviewing these videos. Are we looking at super capitalism memes? I live like a super capitalist every day of my life, Cenk. One thing I will say before I get too much into this, I'm not going to be trying to defend any of these things from a Marxian perspective. I don't consider myself a Marxian, and I don't think that it's worth trying to defend your ideology as living in lines with something that someone said a long time ago. Marx himself was very strongly opposed to markets, as was Engels. However, I think that it's worth noting that their rejection of markets was not followed by a strong defense of another economic mechanism which did explain how to do what markets do, but better. So, with that, Inoxki asks about pronunciation. Oh, that cat's fucking there.
Wake up, liberal. I love you.
All right. So, with little further ado, I will be watching Will We Have to Work Under Socialism. I'm going to let it run for a bit to get the audio levels right, and then I'll just let it keep going. First, okay, I shouldn't do it for the first few seconds because I think he screams at the beginning.
Hello.
Comrades.
Today we're going to be asking the question, will we be working
Test.
The answer is yes.
Test.
Only if we want to.
Test. All right, seems good. Right, now that we've got our lovely, lovely audio levels fixed, we can listen to him scream again. I understand your brain. This piece of shit, man. They come up to the door, they make a noise, and then they run away. I hate him. Oh my god. All right. Let's listen in, and I will be trying not to cut Xexizy off. I'll be trying to let them have full statements and explain themselves, and then only respond after they've given themselves full context.
Hello.
Comrades.
Today we're going to be asking the question, will we be working under socialism? And the answer is yes, but only if we want to, which of course we will, but the nature of this work is going to be fundamentally different. Now, the reason we're talking about this today then...
So I just do want to say, as an introduction, I felt that was very unhelpful. It basically told you, yes, but you'll like it, and I won't explain why yet. One of the reasons that I shifted, I think, towards a more market socialist ideology is in part because it can explain to you what the mechanisms are actually going to be in place. And I think my main critique of this video is going to be that he doesn't talk about the mechanisms of deciding basically how we decide what work is necessary and how we get people to do that work.
Is because this nature is so commonly misunderstood by newer leftists and then even older ones such as Marxist-Leninists. Now, whenever we try to explain something under socialism, we first need to contrast to how it works under capitalism. Under capitalism, a tiny minority of people own the majority of society's tools, machinery, and property.
True.
This is how capitalism has been since its inception and how it must remain in order to continue existing.
True.
As such, for the majority of people in society, it's required that in order to attain basic necessities such as food and rent, you need to first become employed by someone with the means to create useful products.
True.
Being employed by somebody means you're given permission to work on their property with their tools in exchange for a wage.
Xexizy
You
spitting
privately
straight
conduct this
facts.
labour under predefined conditions such as the length of the workday and the rate of pay. During this process, you become alienated from your labour, which
Okay, so we've got the description of work under capitalism, then we've got the description of why it's wrong. I'll let him take it away from there, but first, I gotta look at chat for that parasocial engagement. Pink Wuggan chat. Nerd. Easy W. Now he's gonna explain why is alienation so bad.
and the rate of pay. During this process, you become alienated from your labour, which means you dedicate a portion of your time and effort into creating something which you yourself do not personally have a stake in, but is rather owned by your employer and then sold for a profit. And as such, this means that the thing you're creating isn't even made directly for the sake of usefulness,
Wake up, liberal. I love you.
I'll let him finish.
rather again for profit. And this is particularly relevant to our topic today because it's this
Okay, so the two things that Xexizy mentioned for alienation are commonly mentioned once. I'll let him play it again so I can just quote him directly. I don't need to misquote.
this labor. Under this process, you become alienated from your labor, which means you dedicate a portion of your time and effort into creating something which you yourself do not personally have a stake in.
First is that you produce something that you don't get a stake in. And what he means by this, and I'll let him say it,
But is rather owned by your employer and then
that your employer owns it and your employer gets the profit of it. So the first idea of where alienation comes from is that you participate in the production process, but you are not paid the full proceeds of your labor. Then, two,
sold for a profit. And as such, this means that the thing you're creating isn't even made directly for the sake of usefulness, but
the second thing that actually suggests is that because of profitability, the things that you produce are not in alignment with use value. Now, these are basically the things that I suggested at the beginning of this video that I think, like two of the things that I advocate for constantly are one, trying to internalize externalities so that what we might call societal use value is very close to profitability. Two, talking about the profitability of a product going to the capitalist and not to the individual. It's not clear that this would survive the critique of the market socialists in a system where wealth is generally owned either by workers themselves in like small like personal savings, either by cooperatives in the money that a cooperative has, in a social wealth fund, which is basically like a huge wealth, basically a huge savings fund that everyone in society owns, and nationalized firms. It's not clear where the profit would be going, if not to like the people in a very broad sense. So I think, and I'll let him explain more, I think it's very hard to say that these definitions of alienation would survive under a suitably leftist vision of market socialism. But with that, I will let him continue. And we'll see if we can get any more insights.
rather again for profit. And this is particularly relevant to our topic today because it's this concept of wage labor that forms the underlying basis for this division between work and leisure. Now, by contrast, under socialism, the means of production are owned communally by the workers themselves, rather than privately by any capitalist. And so the only way to organize things is democratically. And
Based, spitting straight facts. Sock dumb, left com. The video volume is low? I thought I turned it up. Should I turn it up more? Oh, I'm sorry if it... Here, let me see if this is a good audio mix.
under socialism, the means of production are owned communally by the workers themselves, rather than privately
Let me turn it up even a little more. Okay, well, I will make it louder. I think it wasn't too bad, but I apologize if it was.
by any socialism.
So he's explaining what will ownership be like, and therefore what will workplace management look like under socialism.
The means of production are owned communally by the workers themselves, rather than privately by any capitalist. And so the only way to organize things is democratically. And furthermore, the alienation of labor disappears too, and with it, the strict divisions of labor begin to fade.
So this is the first part where, to my mind, Basically, he says this is what happens under socialism. But note, he doesn't tell you why. He doesn't name the mechanism. The only mechanism that we've seen so far is the claim that the means of production are communally owned and are therefore democratic. Sure, but it's not clear why democracy removes alienation under his two ideas of alienation, meaning one, the elimination of profit, and two, the elimination of the elimination of profit and the elimination of non-use value production. So I hope he will explain the rest of the video.
Nobody is coerced into working, either by threat of starvation or by some kind of state entity. And furthermore, because workers are no longer alienated from their own labour, the strict divisions of labour fade away too. Looking back at capitalism, when you determined a working day, it meant the following things. For this length of time, you were required to work on somebody else's property in exchange for a wage. The very nature of a set working day implies the existence of a wage, because it's essentially the parameters for the exchange of labour power for money. And furthermore, it implies the existence of an authority over that property, as there needs to be some way to enforce that you continually work on this property and are also only on this property for this set allocated time.
So again, to me, this suggests like a failure of mechanisms. Why is it the case that people would not be coerced to like go into work because of starvation? Well, I think the simple answer that socialists should give is, hey, we want to give everyone basic universal needs. Hey, we want to give everyone universal basic income sort of argument. That, hey, everyone will be provided for regardless of whether they choose to work or not. We want like a truly expensive welfare state where work is less of a coercive system than it is a voluntary system. Markets, asks Pinkwug. Video volume is like 50% of viewers. Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Should be good now. Well, I'm happy to hear that. Or like, stock did left. You peeps have sound. Huh. Well, I'm sorry to hear that. I thought I'd gotten it right. That's frustrating. So, in short, again, lack of mechanisms.
About either the concept of money or the designated owner of property, the concept of a working day makes no sense. And all you're left with is the organic organization of workers only responsible to themselves.
So again, here, there's a suggestion of a mechanism, which is that you have democratic workplaces, you have democratic self-management, but none of the details are really fleshed out in a way that would make it clear why this means that you don't need a workday. Why could it not be that the workers could democratically decide that they do need a workday, which is the case in the vast majority of cooperatives that exist today? I think that the fleshing out of the mechanisms is really necessary here to make a stronger argument for what he's saying.
As such, the way that people begin to view work changes as well. If people are no longer stuck in specific and specialized jobs, but rather have the opportunities to branch out into different careers at will, then they no longer start to see jobs as separate from their own personal lives.
Again, this is one of those things. You need a mechanism. Why is it that workers right now specialize? Well, the reason is, one, because they get paid more if they specialize and they can do work at a really high level. Two, there's a societal utility of that too. The reason they do so is in part because you need certain levels of expertise to do certain jobs. It's very possible that if people switched careers, they wouldn't be able to maintain that level of specificity. There's a reason that very few people, like, there's a financial and also like a human reason why it's difficult for people to quickly switch careers. It is difficult for someone to overnight become like a care worker or a doctor or a teacher because these things require like 4 or 10 years of training. If people are rapidly switching, and I would like a society where people are like, say, free to go back to college at like no cost and pursue another career that is more in line with their interests. But to say that people shouldn't specialize and generally stay in a field for like a given period of time, I think that you need to explain how that would work without like either one, hurting efficiency on the one hand and therefore hurting everyone by reducing like the ability of society to produce goods that people desire, or two, you'd need to explain some way that like, I guess I'll just basically stick on the efficiency point. In short, I'm not sure how this would be feasible.
Marx actually describes the concept quite well in this quote from the German ideology. In a communist society, where nobody has one exclusive sphere of activity, but each can become accomplished in any branch he wishes, society regulates the general production and thus makes it possible for me to do one thing today and another tomorrow. To hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, criticize after dinner, just as I have a mind without ever becoming a hunter, fisherman, herdsman, or critic.
See, the interesting thing here is that like all of these jobs, to our minds, are usually considered manual labor, but they're also jobs that are usually associated with a decent amount of training. Even like farming and so on is associated with a decent amount of training. And this doesn't include any of like the higher level jobs that we'd be talking about as difficult to coordinate under such a system. How do you get someone who is a doctor one day and like a like arts critic the next day, without giving them that training in both fields? I just want mechanisms.
This process, however, is gradual. What I'm referring to here is the lower phase of communism, often referred to as socialism, but during, say, the establishment of the dictatorship of the proletariat, before classes truly
Speaking of bad messaging, instead of saying dictatorship of the proletariat, just say worker democracy. Please, I'm begging you.
abolished, it might be fair to suggest that there might require some mandatory work. As an example,
So here he does suggest one mechanism, which is basically state compulsion of work under the revolution. And I think that this is such an incredibly limited mechanism that it just can't explain anything else he's been talking about in the video.
while this is admittedly a very oversimplistic explanation, what we mostly saw in anarchist Catalonia was a failure of wider organization by the working class to produce enough to fight against the fascist counter-revolutionaries, leading to them being crushed, and obviously this isn't preferable. However, this phase isn't socialism at all yet. It's incapable of attaining socialism due to its own need to defend itself. But is
So the explanation is that, hey, if we force you to work, it's not socialism yet. We've only achieved socialism once work is not coercive.
rather the beginnings of a revolution towards socialism. During the revolution itself, while under threat from all sides, I do think some notion of mandatory work will probably be necessary. But this is just some random person's opinion in the internet, and the actual topic of how to carry out revolution is wildly debated in the left. So if you're interested in this specifically, I would recommend seeking out other people's opinions because it does go beyond the scope of this video.
I'm really not sure who you'd even point to here. Like virtually every society which has successfully, like anarchist Catalonia had mandatory work, yes, but also too, like virtually every society has these sort of examples of work. The only perspectives you get that oppose this are not those that are like writing from these societies. It's generally like theoretical arguments, more akin to this one. Easy Modez says, wait, is SDL saying that it's only work if it's coercive? I'm confused. No, so that wasn't clear. I'm saying that the way Xexizy gets around saying that you'd have to work and it would be coercive under socialism is saying that if there is work and if it is coercive, then it's not socialism. So he said coercive work in the revolution before socialism, the revolution transitioned to socialism, that is not under socialism, so it's not coercion to work under socialism. Once we get to socialism, there will be no coercion to work. As he said in the beginning of the video, it will be more akin to play. So maybe I'll try to clear that up there. And Big Bouncy Bro is saying that I and Pinkwug just lost the left for saying that optics matter.
Ultimately, I think these kinds of things do rest mainly on the organic and spontaneous organization of the revolutionaries themselves. If we've already explained lower phase communism and delved into the dictatorship of the proletariat a bit, what about work under higher phase communism? Well, for that, we have another Marx quote.
So I haven't read the German ideology, but I'm pretty sure both the quote in the German ideology and this quote are describing higher stage communism, not socialism, but I could be wrong.
Higher phase communist society, after the enslaving subordination of the individual to the division of labor, and there within also the antithesis between mental and physical labor has vanished. After labor has become not only a means of life, but life's prime want. After the productive forces are also increased with all-around development of the individual, and all springs of cooperative wealth flow more abundantly. Only then can the narrow horizon of bourgeois rights be crossed in its entirety, and society inscribe in its banners, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. Most importantly, here's the line, after labor has become not a means of life, but life's prime want. What's meant here is that under higher phase communism, the very distinction between work and leisure disappears completely.
So the basic principle of what economics is trying to do is find ways to distribute scarce resources to non-scarce wants. I'm sorry, to unlimited wants. As I guess, would non-scarce work there? I guess, yeah, actually it would. The basic idea is that not everyone can have everything they want right now. It is not possible to provide every single person in the world right now the standard of living that, say, an American enjoys, both for ecological reasons and because of economic reasons. We simply don't have the resources to do them at the current moment. So the goal, theoretically, is to try and find the most efficient way to give everyone the maximum like pleasured life. Economics as a field is often not very interested in like equality and so on. I'm not going to try and defend the field as a whole. That's like the point of the field. When you get like the Marx quotes about higher stage communism, where work is, it's just like life's want, where work and leisure are identical, you're fundamentally describing something in which resources are no longer scarce, in which work is no longer necessary. And I agree that you don't need economics. You don't need to find a way to get people to work efficiently if work is no longer necessary because resources are no longer scarce. If someone asks you like, hey, what is your mechanism for determining how people should use their labor to work with scarce resources, and your solution is to say, well, what if we talked about a society where there wasn't scarce resources? It's just not a very useful like response, in particular because we live so far away from a society where we truly have post-scarcity in virtually every respect. Like even, I guess in short, I think it's easy to understand why in modern society it would not be possible for most people to stop working for society to continue functioning. That's where I'll leave it there.
We've been conditioned all our lives to think of work as time is stolen from us, something that we have to get through so we can continue doing what we actually.
Aref Stama says, the point of the field of economics is to generate narratives that can be actioned by political parties. I mean, I don't disagree that there's a political part of like the field of economics. I guess my broader point is like the idea, like there are Marxian economics, for example, right? I think that they too have an ideological purpose. The point of all of these economists is to try and argue for efficient ways of distributing resources, given the fact that we live in a world of scarcity. There's a reason that economists don't talk about like Marxian economists included don't talk about heaven or like how God should distribute resources, because he's unlimited. He doesn't have that problem.
Want to do, even from the beginning of our school lives up until now. This is because of our alienation, because we're forced by necessity to work for other people's benefits and profits. But in a society where labour is directly social and the means of production are owned communally, it becomes more about meeting the community's wants and needs. And with it, people's very mentalities around work changes. The work you carry out no longer feels separate, but rather a fundamental piece of your life that you actually enjoy, more akin to a hobby than a job.
So again, this is the sort of thing where he's named a mechanism, which is that we have communally owned workplaces. This could either be, let's say, like worker cooperatives, meaning firm level democracy. It could be something like, as he's suggesting, I think, communes, like that the local council in your town or whatever is owning all of the firms or is directing all of the labor. So something akin to, like, say, like a small scale planning economy, decentralized planning. Basically, in both of these models, merely because something's democratic doesn't mean that it's enjoyable. Merely because you have a greater say in what work to do doesn't mean that you have to enjoy doing it. You might have more enjoyment, and we do have a lot of evidence, and this is something I often mention about when arguing in favor of cooperatives. We have a lot of evidence that where workers are involved in management, where workers have a share in how the company operates, they are much happier. They are much less alienated. People like having a say in their lives. They don't live like living under a dictator for 8 hours out of every 24 hours of your life. Cooperatives are good, like thumbs up. But that alone doesn't mean that you have to enjoy work. People like, I don't know how to put it. The mechanism named is not sufficient to get to the outcome named. The mechanism might help get you to the outcome, but it's not getting you all the way there. Easy Mode says, economics is definitely more than convex optimization. Okay, in case it's not clear, I'm not denying the political or like, I'm not trying to deny any of the roles of economics in like justifying existing status quo ideology. Like, I think that should be obvious in any statement. Like the very nature of like the production of ideology, the production of knowledge is tied up in the fact that people are supported by the status quo and will tend to produce evidence which supports said status quo if they are driven by like the financial and cultural mores of said status quo. Like, I don't disagree with any of that. I'm not trying to say otherwise. I'm just saying like the good parts of economics are this idea of the science of like trying to solve scarcity. Okay, please. Big Bouncy Bro says, would the democratization of firms hurt their efficiency? Well, there's a whole argument there. I think the evidence leans that democratization either doesn't improve efficiency, like it's zero, or it improves efficiency, it's slightly above zero. But that's a whole debate, and we don't need to get into that at the current moment.
Of course, this doesn't mean that every moment of your life and whatever work you do,
you are not frustrating me, don't worry.
than a job. Of course, this doesn't mean that every moment of your life and whatever work you do, it will be pure bliss. But you will be working for yourself and your community. You'll be owning directly the product of your own labor, and you'll no longer be alienated from it.
So again, we've kind of got outcomes mentioned, and a little bit like mechanisms mentioned. You own the output of your labor. Okay, sure. So I would say that like the kind of society I've described, this is also true. So if this is the mere condition that you need to reach to say that like we are no longer having work, that we've like reached the point at which like people are totally happy in their work, it's no longer coercive or whatever, sure. I just don't think that that's a reasonable way to describe this system of relations. Unless you think that like some level of coercion is not required to get people to do like the hard, like a lot of the jobs that we do are really annoying, like and people hate doing them. A lot of jobs like paperwork, which, you know, socialism isn't going to eliminate the need to do some paperwork. It's not going to eliminate the need to do some management. It's not going to need to eliminate the need to do like heavy lifting or like janitorial work, which people don't seem to enjoy. I fundamentally, I guess it seems to me like saying that people would have to be paid in some way to like be given some additional benefits to make them go do that stuff, that seems like coercion to me. But if the only definition of no longer being coerced to work is simply that you own the products of your labor and like your product is useful for society and society has decided that it is so, then I think that we've already reached this in a market socialist utopia. Which is part of why I don't think that that's a very useful definition of when it means to say that work is coercive.
Of course, none of this occurs immediately under lower phase communism. This is all higher phase communism, and the very existence of labor vouchers, say, in lower phase communism would suggest this. Even if themselves they're not currency or wages, as they don't mediate the exchange between commodities that hold value, they're still something you receive in exchange for working, and therefore would probably go towards maintaining a barrier between work and leisure time. However, even with the
Yeah, that's called coercion. That's called being forced to work. Like, just say it.
These barriers carrying on to lower phase communism, these birthmarks of capitalism, to suggest that any kind of mandatory work would exist with set working times and places, just completely goes against the concept of what socialism actually is.
So one of the problems that I have is name a mechanism, suggest an outcome. The mechanism is not sufficient to get to the outcome. The mechanism of, hey, either firms are like owned by, say, like a union or like their cooperatives, or two, you've got a commune that like locally sets what the labor is. Shad Guevara asks, just got here, is this guy saying you wouldn't have to work under socialism? That is the basic thesis of this video. It's that no, you wouldn't need to work, especially as you progress towards higher state of socialism. And I think that this is absurd. But I do think that the thesis he's promoting is not so absurd if you watch the whole video, but I do think that it is not a valid way of using these terms. In short, the mechanism they proposed is democratic ownership, whether it be from the community or at the firm level. And the outcome they propose is that you therefore won't have set work times. It seems very easy to imagine that this mechanism would lead to set work times, that it would lead to you being stuck in a given career for a while. For example, if they say, hey, if you want to get labor vouchers for participating in Bob's meat packing factory, cooperative owned, then you need to come from like 8 a.m. to like 6 p.m., right? It seems very easy to imagine that the workers could democratically decide that, and it seems very easy to imagine that the community could democratically decide that, because cooperatives are already deciding stuff like that right now. Now, they could argue that, hey, well, maybe these things would be operating outside of the market, but then the question becomes, what is the mechanism what is the mechanism for determining where resources go between firms and communities and individuals, which makes it such that now they aren't in a mechanism where they need to care about producing things efficiently. Because if they no longer need to care about producing things efficiently, then sure, maybe they don't care about like worker hours. But if they do care about producing more stuff, they probably do care when you come in and how like often you come in. Pinkwug says, I wish you would define work, because that's almost a colloquial usage, and that's how people there's also a colloquial usage, and that's how people mostly understand it. So I think that what we might be getting at is a little bit is this often Marxian definition of work versus a non-Marxian definition of work. And often Marxians will say that work is wage labor. Specifically, you're like laboring under a capitalist economy to get paid in money, which you then use to go and buy like goods and services. I think that I'm trying to use work in like the concept of like you are forced by societal structures to go and do something that you don't want to do. And perhaps this is the disagreement here, but if it's just a semantic thing, then him saying that, hey, if we change the market structure so radically that it's no longer equivalent to like the current market, and that counts as like not being the type of work that we talk about today, not being the type of wage labor we talk about today, and that counts, then I think that you can very easily extend this sort of argument towards like a market socialist system. So, yep.
The only way that such things could ever exist in any image of socialism is if there was some kind of state to exist to own and mediate this property. But then property wouldn't be communally owned, it would be state-owned.
One of the big things is, I think that there's this equivocation. I'll let him finish. I shouldn't cut him off.
Mediate this property. But then property wouldn't be communally owned, it would be state-owned. And even if the representatives of the state were chosen as democratically as possible, these representatives would still hold more power over the means of production than any individual worker. The only reason to ever assert that such a system is socialist is because you've preemptively decided that the USSR and similar societies are socialism. And therefore, to maintain this worldview, you have to advocate its various features as socialism, such as mandatory work, commodity production, and state ownership.
Okay, so we've heard enough. He says, basically, hey, if the state owns the means of production, then it would be able to mediate and would be able to set terms of when you could work. And therefore, because socialism is only when there is no more coerced labor, when you are, basically in his example, when you are no longer forced to come into work at a given set of hours, then it's not socialist, because the state can force you to come in at a given set of hours, and therefore it's not socialism, because socialism is when you don't have set hours. And he also extends this to say that this would apply even if, instead of talking about the state, we're just talking about representatives of the people, which seems to imply to me that he is talking in like a leftcom or like mutualist framework, because the only context in which you can really do direct democracy, where there are no representatives and you're just communally doing like production, would be something on the model of like ancient Athens or like the so-called like council communism sort of models. And the fundamental problem there is, even without representatives, democracy can force you to do stuff you don't want to do. Like Athens was renowned for its and I think it's a really interesting political tool, I suppose, is called exile. That's literally where the term comes from. Athens, if a majority of citizens, no, that's not true. I forget the exact barrier, but if a certain percent of citizens voted to kick you out of Athens, you had to leave Athens for 10 years. Athens could appoint generals. Athens could conscript people. Athens went to war. Just because it's close to direct democracy doesn't mean that it doesn't have force behind it. So yeah, I think that it's very, I don't think you can just wriggle out of this by saying, well, it's the community doing it, not the state. Well, the community has power. I don't really know how to engage with this other than to say that. Easy Modes says, socialism is when there's no set hours, and the fewer set hours, the more socialist it is. True.
Wake up, little.
Later,
I love you.
the later and more high I can come into work, the more socialism it is. And sign me the fuck up. Let's see. Oops. All right.
But as we've seen, none of these ideas are found in Marx. And so, if there are any newer leftists watching this video, the one thing I'd ask you to take...
Before I go too far on that, let me just repeat what he said.
But as we've seen, none of these ideas are found in Marx.
But as we've seen, none of these ideas are found in Marx. Let me find real quick. What am I looking for? It's... Market? Is it this one? Oh. So I quite liked this article from a guy named Roosevelt, which has nothing to do, as far as I'm aware, with like the President Roosevelt. And one of the things that it notes is this quote that just to read it out, I guess. Perhaps the most general criticism leveled against Marx is that he seems not to have paid attention to the fact that there are only two known ways in which the economic activities of society can be organized, these being the market and some form of political process, i.e. planning of one kind or another. Before one recommends the elimination of one of these options, one should be reasonably certain that the other will work. That Marx did not engage in this necessary thought process may be seen in a well-known passage in the German ideology, in which he quotes the exact same passage that Xexizy quoted about someone being able to be a hunter, a fisherman, a shepherd, or a critic. The basic idea here is if you have a limited set of ideas, right? Like let's say that within the possible universe of ideas, there are only two ideas. The entire universe of ideas has only two possible truth states. So the example would be like it could either be A or not A or something, right? So like it is either true that it is sunny outside or it is not true that it's sunny outside, which I know is a trivial and somewhat, and you can understand. If it's only possible that there's two truth states, then necessarily, if you reject one, right? If you reject one, you're necessarily accepting the alternative. And the same sort of logic applies for economic forces. If there's only two possible models, and I won't actually agree that there's only two possible models, but if you think that there's only two possible models, then necessarily rejecting one, which let's say is markets, and rejecting one is identical to accepting the other. So you reject markets, as Marx does. That means you have to accept planning. The problem that I see a lot of people do is they spend a lot of time hitting on markets. They really spend a lot of time hitting on markets, right? They're really asking it out. But they spend almost no time explaining why this one is good. If it's true that market's bad, it should be easy to explain why planning good. And you don't get that in Marx. As much as I've read of Marx, which, I can't say that I'm like the Marx scholar, but I've read Capital 1 and 2. I've read like a whole bunch of passages from his other books, usually as quoted in like readings in other articles. And he never really lays out how his form of planning works, how incentives work, how resources are divvied out, how labor works. He never really goes into detail on these structures. He always keeps it at the vaguest possible level. And I think that that's a real failing. You should never be spending more time rejecting a system than promoting your alternative system. If your alternative really is better, you should be spending, 2-3 times as much time talking about this. One of the things that I really like about socialists like Matt Brunig, or another guy on Twitter would be like James Medlock. But I think this one's a SocDem. I think Brunig is a socialist. One of the things that I like is they spend a lot of time, like 5-10 times more of their time talking about the things that they like about a better future. Like they like cooperatives, they like social wealth funds, they like certain types of welfare reforms. And this is setting up like a vision for the future, explaining why it's good, instead of spending all your time tearing down something, because tearing down something doesn't actually prove that the alternative works, unless you can prove the alternative is worse. So I actually think he's right that it never appears in Marx, but that's a problem. That's a failure of Marx. Marx fucked up. Marx got that one wrong. If you're going to have a principled critique of markets, you need to have the principle of raising up of planning. And Marx never did it. He really never did. The AK Prime says, don't Marxists already kind of accept that Marx didn't really advocate his preferred system? Marx's goal was more to point out the problems of capitalism. That's precisely the point. The man spent 2,000 pages in Das Kapital hating on capitalism. Did he spend 2,000 pages advocating for the right way to do Marxian socialism? No. He saw his role as a critic of capitalism. He did not see himself as an architect of the future. So we gotta be. And you sure as hell can't do so just by saying capitalism bad. You gotta say something good. The next system good.
And so, if there are any newer leftists watching this video, the one thing I'd ask you to take away is that the idea of a working day under socialism, if it's nothing more than a liberal holdover for the revolutionaries that struggle to imagine a society radically different to their own.
So, the takeaway from this video is...
of a work is are found in Marx. And so, if there are any newer leftists watching this video, the one thing I'd ask you to take away is that...
The one thing he'd ask you to take away is that... Drumroll.
The idea of a working day under socialism, if it's nothing more than a liberal holdover for the revolutionaries that struggle to imagine a society radically different to their own.
So there you have it. Socialism is when no working day. Maybe I need to like do the Richard Wolff meme. But so I want to be nice, and like I said at the beginning of the video, I'm trying. If I ever critique leftists, I both try, and I think that it is a moral imperative to focus only on constructive critiques and trying to say that, hey, I think this mechanism fails. Hey, I think that this tactic to get to socialism fails. Not to do some like petty character assassination, like ad hominem bullshit. I do think this is a really bad argument, though. Because I fundamentally, the critique that I've been raising at the very beginning is one, and I think this all started because I was going to have a debate with Xexizy about market socialism. I think all of the arguments that he raised about how work as we understand it would basically disappear under socialism would also be true under market socialism. And two, the mechanisms he explained for getting to it under what I assume is like a council communist society. That seems to be what he was leaning into, but I couldn't tell. They seem to be the mechanisms aren't sufficiently fleshed out, meaning sufficiency here would be like, if we know that X is true, then necessarily Y is true, that it's sufficient. But sometimes it has to be true that X and Y and Z are all true for A to be true. And so I think that just saying X is true is not sufficient to prove that A is true. It's not just sufficient to say that, hey, there's democracy, hey, the workers are in that democracy, hey, there's the community in there too, and therefore everyone's going to like work. Therefore, you won't need a working day. I don't think that I don't think one follows from the other. I think there are other things that you need to be able to make those follow. Like, for example, saying, hey, post scarcity true, and therefore you don't need the working day because you don't need to force workers to work because work isn't necessary in the first damn place. So yeah, I think main things I like about this video. One, I do think it is useful to try and escape capitalist realism and think about a future where work is not nearly so coercive as it is today and where work is a lot more free. To think about a world in which people can choose their career, they can switch between careers much more freely. I think we can move towards that world in a world, say, of like free college, a world of like highly subsidized welfare, where it is not a risk of like starvation and destitution if you lose your job, but it is increasingly more of a choice. I think that this is a world to strive for. I think it's good that he's thought outside of the box. I think, unfortunately, that his outside of the box thinking, however, and this is the main critique, was bereft of mechanisms which meaningfully could arrive at said conclusion. With that, I'm probably going to say goodnight because it's past my bedtime. I started late.